Good evening, everybody. So that was a fantastic introduction. I think, though, our esteemed MC might have called me a performance artist. I'm actually a performance scientist. Sorry, I don't want to disappoint you. I won't be doing any dances or shows for you this evening. But I am here to tell you about sustainable high performance. A performance scientist is somebody, in my case, who investigates and explores human performance. And I do that in all kinds of different domains, from sport to business, from Formula One drivers to Fortune 500 executives. But that wasn't always the case. I'll tell you about that in a moment. I work for a company called Hewitt Performance, and we provide high-performance coaching services to many drivers and teams. We've been quite successful in that domain. Drivers who we work with have won 13 World Driver Championships. Drivers who Hewitt works with and we coach have been on the podium 96% of the time over the last 4 seasons. I think we probably agree that is sustainable high performance. But I haven't always been in Formula One working in that domain. Actually, my sporting career began in professional cycling. I was desperate to become a professional cyclist. So, 15 years ago, I moved from my home in the UK to France to pursue my dream of becoming a professional cyclist. That's when my fascination with human performance really started to grow and accelerate. Unfortunately, my cycling career didn't quite reach the heights that I hoped. So I returned to the UK, I went back to university, I studied sports science, and eventually, like a good failed athlete, I set up my own coaching business. Now, during this time, I started to work with elite athletes and professional athletes. But the bread and butter of my business was actually working with knowledge workers, people who were solicitors, architects, finance professionals, entrepreneurs, management consultants, people who were working in London, where I was based, who spent 18 or more hours in the day in the office and for whatever reason, at the end of that day, decided that they wanted to pursue very challenging cycling events. 3 important things happened during this time. The first was that I became fascinated with knowledge work. I became fascinated with the workplace. I became fascinated because I had incredible tools to measure physical performance. I didn't really know how to quantify or measure knowledge work, people who think for a living. The second development was that I started to apply tools and frameworks from sports science to try and understand and quantify knowledge work better. And this led to the third development, a development that you could even call a revelation. This revelation that I could view knowledge work, I could view thinking for a living as a cognitive endurance activity. So knowledge work is an endurance activity. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer exploring this at Hewitt. I'm also an academic researcher conducting a number of original research projects, looking in particular at knowledge workers and variables including their daily rhythms of work and rest, their sleep, their stress, their positive mood, and as an output, their cognitive performance. We're going to explore a number of different themes today, but the main question is this: what is the key to sustainable high performance? You see, in sport and in business, I think one of the keys to sustainable high performance is to identify what I describe as decisive moments. Now this week, we've got the Singapore Grand Prix in town, haven't we? I think it's probably my favourite Formula One Grand Prix. Are there any Formula One fans in this room? A few? Maybe. Well, anyway, anyone who's interested in motorsport, you'll notice that these drivers are flying around these circuits. It almost looks flat out. But the reality is, in motorsport, that if you drive at full speed the whole time, well, as long as you don't crash, you actually won't go the fastest. Driving is actually about finding the limit of grip, but also managing your tyres. Because if you drive too hard, too quick, your tyres start to break down. You need to choose the right moment, the perfect moment to push. When it's worth degrading those tyres, when it's worth wearing them out a little bit quicker to maybe get a gap from a competitor, to maybe catch somebody else. But if you make that effort, if you put that effort in the wrong place at the wrong time, and your tyres degrade too quickly, you'll lose that grip and maybe the race will be lost. I think there's a lesson there that we can take that applies to life, to business. Because I think we all experience these decisive moments. Decisive moments where, if we're careful to apply that effort in the right place at the right time, when to push into the red, but also deciding when is the right time to step back, to maybe take it easy and recover and wait. If we do that, then effort can be multiplied. If we put effort in the right place at the right time, the efforts that we can make can grow, they can expand. But if we don't, if we push too hard when maybe we should have taken it easy, races can be lost, deals can be lost. I think this clicker is lost by the looks of it, but I'll continue. There are 3 lessons, I think, that we can take from the world of sport, from motorsport, from endurance sport, that apply equally well to the endurance activity of knowledge work. The first lesson is this: we can achieve better results for similar effort, providing we apply that effort in the right place at the right time. Secondly, we need to be disciplined to recover, to take it easy, to take a setback, sometimes even when we don't feel like it. And finally, perhaps most importantly, we need to find and follow our own rhythm, rather than always following someone else's. Start to pay attention to when we and our teams are at their best. Now, maybe we consider rhythms in sports, and we consider rhythms in motorsport in particular, but do we ever consider rhythms in the workplace, in cognitive performance? We rarely do. But whether we consider these rhythms or not, as many of you answered using your smartphones earlier, cognitive performance varies. It varies during the average day by about 20%. But were you among the 79% of people who checked their smartphones within 15 minutes of waking up this morning? Did anybody manage to wait 15 minutes by the sound? Look at those statistics. They didn't. According to these statistics, most people do check their smartphone within 15 minutes of waking up in the morning. They don't start the day on their own rhythm. They start it on someone else's, whoever has sent them an email. Does that sound familiar? According to some research, 42% of people admit to using their email in the bathroom. Would have never done that, obviously. The average knowledge worker, according to some studies, is interrupted once every 11 minutes. Do you ever get to 11 minutes? I often don't. We check in on communication tools once every 6 minutes. And what do we do at the end of those demanding days to relax? When we get home, maybe we put something on the big screen, but we can't just watch a show anymore or a film, can we? We have to switch between that big screen, our smartphone, and our tablet computer an average of 21 times per hour. We're never resting. We're rarely focused. We're always on. But we can't always be on. We see that in sport. If we're honest, we see it in business. We are not machines. But we rarely pay attention to rhythms, to the natural variation, often to what our body is telling us. So when your cognitive performance varies by 20% throughout the day, are you aware of that? Are you aware of when you're at your best? Well, over today's presentation, I'm going to give you some ideas about how you can find that. About 20% of the population, maybe 1 in 5 people of the people in this room, experience that 20% variation as a peak, followed by a valley in the middle, and then a rebound later in the day. You might call yourself an early bird. You'll generally prefer mornings. I'm not sure if you're into audience participation here, but if you feel like you're an early bird, can you raise your hand? A few. Well, about another 20% of the population experience this variation in reverse. They start the day with a rebound, valley in the middle, their peak period right here, later in the day into the evening. Have we got any owls, any people who prefer the evenings here? You raise your hand. Yeah, a few. Well, everybody else, the other 40%, they seem to fall somewhere in between. But regardless of whether you're an early bird, an owl, or somewhere in the middle, you're probably not paying attention to your rhythms. And it's very likely that if you're not paying attention to those rhythms, you're limiting your cognitive performance. See, each of those 3 phases has distinct characteristics. The peak is generally the best time for focus, for that analytic, for that productive work, which means doing it in the morning if you're an early bird, later in the day if you're an owl. That valley is a great moment for rest, for recovery and reflection. And the rebound is a good chance for the menial tasks, the switching work, which makes up at least part of most knowledge workers' days. But we're not paying attention to those rhythms. It's unlikely we're synchronizing our work with them, and we're limiting our performance. And it's a problem, because human cognitive performance is going to become an increasingly important differentiator in the future of work. Some of you are probably aware various forms of evidence suggest that 30% of the work we do, 30% of our roles, could be automated with technology that's already been demonstrated. But as a human performance scientist, and as knowledge workers here, I'm actually much more interested in the 70%. The 70% that can't be automated yet. The 70% that is very likely to be characterized by our most human capabilities. Capabilities that include things like complex problem solving, collaboration, and creativity. But these capabilities will not emerge at their full potential with our current ways of living and working, because they're the output of a rested and focused brain. I don't think that the real risk in high-performance knowledge work is automation. The real risk is not that these machines are going to keep working increasingly like humans. The real risk is that we humans will keep trying to work like machines. We can't always be on. I think the solution might be quite simple. More human rhythms of work and rest, being clear about where to focus effort, knowing when to rest, finding and following our own rhythm, at least when we can, paying a bit more attention to when we are at our best. Of all the data that I've gathered and the various studies that I've done, and I could dive into detail, but not in the 15 minutes I've got, I can summarize it quite simply. It's quite intuitive. People who follow rhythms of work and rest feel better and perform better. If you're too stressed and you're sleep deprived, it's unlikely that you're performing sustainably. What a surprise. You know that inadequate sleep affects more than 1 in 3 adults. And inadequate sleep, for those who answered the poll, if you said it's less than 7 hours, you're correct. The vast weight of evidence demonstrates that we need to sleep 7 to 9 hours to perform at our best, and also to decrease the likelihood of bad things happening to our health later in life. Unfortunately, we're also very good at deceiving ourselves. If you're sleeping less than 7 hours, you probably think you're fine, and you're probably not, according to the evidence. But I can dig into that in more detail as well. But essentially, human beings have a great capacity for self-deception. Did you know that after 18 hours of wakefulness, so that's equivalent to being awake and working from 8 a.m. in the morning until 2 a.m. the next day, your cognitive performance is equivalent to being legally drunk in most European countries. When was the last time you congratulated a colleague for turning up to work wasted? Unlikely. But many of us are operating regularly in this state. So what can we do about it? Well, you might have heard that when we use these smartphone devices and laptops and smartphones, they emit blue-enriched light, a lot of bright light. If you use those devices within 2 hours of going to sleep, it suppresses a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin can disrupt your body clock. It can also mean that it takes longer to get to sleep, and your sleep quality isn't as good. So in a perfect world, we would limit our exposure to these electronic devices for 2 hours before sleep. But how realistic is that? How many people are actually going to avoid looking at their phone in the evening? To be perfectly honest, I don't want to. I quite like, watching TV, watching Netflix with my wife, for example. So what can you do? Well, fortunately, my bias was to try and find any evidence which would support my Netflix habit, and thankfully there's some out there. Because there's a body of research which describes how the cells in our eyes actually encode information about how bright light is over quite a long period of time. And actually the light exposure that we have has an effect that's based on contrast. Basically, if you expose yourself to enough bright light during the day, that can offset some of the bright light exposure that you get from these devices in the evening. So very simply, if you've got a Netflix habit like me, make sure that during the morning, particularly up to lunchtime, you turn the lights on bright inside. Ideally, you get outside, get some sunlight, and that will offset some of that bright light exposure later in the day into the evening. But obviously, ideally, we'd probably, most of us, be sleeping a little bit more, ideally 7 to 9 hours. If you were going to make an investment of time, sleeping an extra hour, if you're sleeping less than 7 hours, is probably one of the best things that you could do for both your health and your performance. But there's another slightly more controversial idea. Does anyone here use a sleep tracker? If you are not sleeping enough, there is a very strong case to stop tracking your sleep. See, our perception of our sleep exerts an effect on our performance, regardless of how much we actually slept. So they've done some interesting studies on this. They did some back in 2014. I've got a colleague who's working on this at Harvard at the moment. Our perception of our sleep has a direct influence on our cognitive performance. If you trick somebody into thinking they got less sleep than they actually got, and their sleep was lower quality, their cognitive performance gets worse relative to a control condition. If you trick somebody and tell them that their sleep was better, was longer and higher quality than it actually was, their cognitive performance gets better relative to their control condition. So if you can't sleep enough for whatever reason, and you're using some kind of tracker, just don't look at it. It will only make you feel worse. Does anyone here like naps? NASA and the Federal Aviation Administration back in the 90s did a very comprehensive research project to try and investigate and discover the optimal duration of a nap. They concluded the optimal nap duration is 26 minutes long. A 26-minute nap can improve subsequent task performance by 34% and subsequent alertness by 50%. Now, I've got an upgraded version of this for you that I'd like to release this evening. Has anyone heard of the Nappuccino? The Nappuccino is my favorite kind of nap. It takes advantage of the fact that when you consume a caffeinated drink, it takes about 45 minutes for that caffeine to reach peak concentration in your bloodstream. So if you consume your favorite caffeinated drink, take a nap, as you're sleeping, that caffeine will start to increase its concentration in your bloodstream, wake you up, and at the end of that 26 minutes, the caffeine will help to overcome some of the sleep inertia, that kind of grogginess that you feel at the end of a nap. So if you haven't tried it, I encourage you to. We need to find these moments to switch off, because we are not machines, we're not robots. We can't always be on. Now, are you aware of your rhythms at all? Are you working with them? Are you working against them? Are you ignoring them completely? Now, I've worked a lot with athletes in endurance sport, and we often use this idea of training zones or intensity zones. Perhaps you've come across it before. So I came up with a framework to plan for cognitive endurance that might be able to help us achieve this sustainable high performance in knowledge work. And I call it cognitive gears. So I'd like you to imagine for a moment that there are 3 cognitive gears that you can see hidden behind this big gear in the middle. There is a low cognitive gear that is characterized by time that we're spending recovering, resting, recharging. Then there is a high cognitive gear. That's characterized by time that's spent in focused, high analytic, productive work. And then there's a middle cognitive gear. A middle gear that's characterized by the switching tasks, the menial work that makes up at least part of most knowledge workers' days. If you think for a moment about these 3 cognitive gears, a high cognitive gear of real focus, a low cognitive gear of recovery, and a middle gear of switching tasks, where do you spend most of your time? I think most of us find that we spend the majority of our time stuck. We spend it stuck in a cognitive middle gear. A middle gear that's characterized by being caught in pseudo work and switching, feeling stressed, feeling like we're on someone else's schedule, answering phone calls and emails in the middle of the night. So what can we do? Well, as we start to approach our own finish line today, I'd like to share a few practical ideas so you can take this theory and put it into action. But the first idea is this: don't make perfect the enemy of good enough. So many of us are bombarded with information about what we should do for our well-being, and sometimes there's a temptation to think that unless we're doing everything perfectly, it's not worth it. But I encourage you to maybe just think of one thing that you could try and apply. Maybe do an experiment. It could be an experiment that you do at an individual level. Perhaps it's something that you do as a group But whatever the case, try and pick one idea and try and put it into action. The first ideas that I have are for that high cognitive gear. Do you ever schedule your most demanding cognitive tasks with the peak in your day? Whether you're an early bird at the start or an owl who likes to work in the evening? Secondly, I mentioned already, we check in on our communication tools once every 6 minutes. How long do you manage to work for before you end up pulling out one of these devices? My challenge to us all today is to experiment with working 25 minutes on and 5 minutes off. When was the last time you spent 25 minutes focused on something without pulling out a communication tool or checking an email? Related to this, evidence suggests we're interrupted on average once every 11 minutes. Your only chance of working for 25 minutes without checking a tool or being interrupted is to do what I call engineering an environment for focus. You need to create an environment for focus. That means for 25 minutes, turn off notifications, shut down your email. If you need to put on some noise-cancelling headphones, you'd be amazed what you can achieve in a brief period of focused attention. For that low cognitive gear, when to take a rest, how to recover. Well, you could begin by actually scheduling some rest. When was the last time that you actually put recovery in your diary? We fill our diaries and schedules with meetings and other commitments. When was the last time you put in a break? We see consistently with high performers in both sport and business that they work hard, but they recover harder. Secondly, the most effective way to recover, probably the most potent performance enhancer, is to sleep adequately. And unfortunately, that means 7 to 9 hours. But during the day, we can recover too. And the most effective breaks are active, social, and natural. Get outside, try and get some bright blue light to offset that screen in the evening. Spend some time with some people that you like, maybe move around, something I'm going to talk about later. Even top performers need pit stops. Even the best need to stop and pause occasionally. For that middle gear, the gear where we spend so much of our time, menial work, switching tasks are an inevitable part of pretty much all of our days, but could you put some boundaries around those switching tasks so it doesn't leak into every single moment? Could you synchronize the switching tasks and the menial work that you have to do, maybe with the rebound in your day? For some people, that's going to be towards the end of the day, in the afternoon. For people who are early birds, that's probably another point. But the rebound, wherever you are, is a time when you're more likely to be distracted anyway. So try to synchronize all those little tasks with your rebound, wherever that is. And whether you're an early bird or an owl or somewhere in the middle, just try to start your day on your own schedule. If you want to check your smartphone, go for it, but I encourage you, experiment. Try having that first 15 minutes for you without immediately leaping onto someone else's agenda for your day. Evidence suggests that improving employee well-being might be able to increase productivity by 19%. But the effect for an individual is perhaps more important. The mood boost associated with improving sleep quality, according to some studies, was equivalent to winning £200,000 on the lottery. Might be worth thinking about when bonus time comes around again, just let people sleep a little bit more. But regardless of how you approach this, a renewed focus could enable people to experience reduced stress, enhance their recovery. So what is the key to sustainable high performance? Well, I actually think there are 3. The first is to be clear about where to focus effort. The second is to be more disciplined about when and where to rest. And finally, perhaps most importantly, find and follow your own rhythm. Start to pay a bit more attention to when you are at your best, because knowledge work is an endurance activity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James, for those wonderful insights into sustainable high performance.